Wow, a very quiet room. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Herman Berliner, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of Hofstra University's Frank G. Zarb School of Business. Today, I also have the pleasure of welcoming you to the Zarb School Annual Distinguished Lecture. For all of us working in business or in business education, enhancing the benefit of business education or graduate business education for our students, who are the next generation of key professionals, is a top priority. Being inextricably interwoven, we benefit our students by also benefiting business and vice versa. I believe that overall both sectors already do a very good job, but there's certainly room to do more. To be more responsive, we need to know what business will look like in the years ahead, what business needs from education in the years ahead, and what the best opportunities for our graduates will be in the years ahead. Our speakers today and our moderator are superbly qualified to shed a clearer light on the world of business as we transition from today to tomorrow. Ajay Banga is President and Chief Executive Officer of Mastercard and a member of its board of directors. Mr. Banga is a member of the U.S. President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations and sits on the board of directors of the U.S.-India Business Council, where he served as its longest tenured chairman. Mr. Banga also served as a member of President Obama's Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. He was awarded the Padma Shri Award by the President of India in 2016. He is a fellow of the Foreign Policy Association and was awarded the Foreign Policy Association Medal in 2012. Mr. Banga serves on the Executive Committee of the Business Roundtable and the Financial Services Roundtable and is Vice Chairman of the Business Council. He's a member of the Board of Overseers of the Weill Cornell Medical Center and the Board of Governors of the American Red Cross. Jane Edison Stevenson is Vice Chairman, Board and CEO Services at Korn Ferry. She leads the firm's global CEO succession practice and regularly serves Fortune 500 clients and high-growth companies on CEO and board succession, leadership development, recruitment, top team effectiveness, and innovation leadership issues. She has been acknowledged by Businessweek as one of the 100 most influential search consultants in the world. A thought leader on governance and innovation, Ms. Stevenson has appeared in numerous media outlets globally, including Businessweek, Fortune, Bloomberg, Reuters, The Wall Street Journal, Innovation Excellence, Leader's Edge, and Strategy Plus Business. Ms. Stevenson co-authored the best-selling business book, Breaking Away: How Great Leaders Create Innovations That Drive Sustainable Growth and Why Others Fail. It was published by McGraw-Hill. She's a recent recipient of the prestigious Maurice Holland Award for her work in this area. Ms. Stevenson is a trustee on the board of the Committee on Economic Development, where she serves as a member of the Policy and Impact Committee and as co-chair of the Women's Economic Contribution Committee. Frank G. Zarb, our moderator today, is a senior advisor to Promontory Financial Group. He also serves as a senior advisor to Hellman and Friedman. Mr. Zarb previously served as chair and CEO of the National Association of Security Dealers and as chair and CEO of the NASDAQ stock market. He also held appointments as chairman, CEO, and president of Alexander & Alexander Services, Inc., vice chairman of the Travelers, Inc., chairman and CEO of Smith Barney, and senior partner at Lazard Frères & Company. Mr. Zarb also served as a senior official for all United States government energy-related activities in his role as executive director of the Cabinet-level Energy Resources Council, administrator of the Federal Energy Administration, and assistant to the president for Energy Affairs. He was the energy czar. He also served as assistant secretary of labor and held various assignments within the Nixon, Ford, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administration. Mr. Zarb, a BS and MBA graduate of Hofstra, served as former chairman of Hofstra's Board of Trustees and presently serves as a board member. He also regularly teaches a course at the business school named in his honor. To begin our program, I'm pleased to introduce Frank Zarb.
Thank you very much. I'm always surprised at the number of people that turn out for these kind of events, and nice to see you all. Is the sound all right up there? Yeah, okay, good. It kind of reminds me of this is really an old joke. It was told to me by a senator. It goes back to now about 1975, and he told a story about the prisoner that was about to be hung, and he was out by the gallows, and the hangman said, "We have some time for your last comments." And the poor guy said, "I don't want to say anything." The hangman said, "What do you mean you don't want to say anything? We got CNN here, you got to..." And he said, "I don't want to say anything." But there was a congressman in the audience. Congressman got up and said, "Will the gentleman yield?" And the poor guy said, "Sure, but hang me first." We're lucky to have Ajay and Jane with us today. And the questions that we're going to get into, and the way we will frame it is we'll have a couple of brief opening statements, and then I'll address a question, and it'll take a life of its own. And if there's anybody in the audience that wants to ask a question or make a comment, we'll recognize them. But the panel is with it. And that's terribly important these days as the business world demands a different kind of trained leader. We've talked about this, Herman and I, a number of times. The runway to failure has gotten very, very short. When I was your age, Kodak was the greatest film company in the world, cameras and film, and they made $1 gazillion. And they had probably 7 or 8 years where they were alerted to digital cameras, but didn't do anything about it. And I've kind of looked into some of these companies, and what's happened inside the company is that they did have the digital technology, but they looked at the income statement and saw all this money being made by film and made a short-sighted conclusion: I don't want to compete with myself, so let's ignore it. Well, they did ignore it, but the Japanese did not, and just ate their lunch. Some time later, and more recently, and in your lifetime, you saw BlackBerry. I had a BlackBerry. I love the device. But it didn't pick up the signals and see the future. And there was Apple sitting out there, and they had a very short runway to make a change and didn't make it. So it's a challenging time for young leaders coming out of business school. And it's a different time. It's a time for students to challenge what they're being taught, to think about it, to raise questions about it, to verify that what the text says is correct. So we're lucky to have two folks here that really know the real world and what's happening out there. And I want to get started by Ajay asking you to say a few opening comments.
Me first?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I thought Jane would
Ajay. Jane, go first.
go.
Well, chivalry isn't dead.
There you go.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and listening to the introduction, there was one thing that wasn't mentioned that may, in fact, be the best qualification to be speaking for you today, and that is that I live sort of at the intersection between many boardrooms in the world and my role as a mother of a 22-year-old daughter who right now is awaiting a hopeful call to get her first job out of school, and a son who's 19. And so looking at that trajectory between the boardroom and selecting CEOs of the future and dealing with the emergence of adulthood with my own children is a really interesting juxtaposition. And it's not an easy world that we live in today, and there's a lot of change afoot. As I think about it, from my own perspective, when I was sitting in chairs much like yours, we're really looking at a number of key shifts. I live in Atlanta, flew up this morning, and as I was sitting on the plane catching up with some of the news very early, I saw a quote of the day, and I thought it just captured it perfectly. Someone was commenting on the head of Waymo, Alphabet's auto driving unit, and it said, he needs to be a futurist, a technologist, a salesman, a counter-regulator, a hacker, and a financier. And I said, thank you, Wall Street Journal, because that was really just perfect for what I wanted to share in just a few opening comments, because we're going to have a conversation with you about what we're seeing as the shift and the change in the world today. But I think we're moving on a couple key fronts. We're moving from a world where information was power to a world where context is power. And I think you could see a number of examples of that in Washington, in the way we have to make decisions quickly. And the problem today isn't that we don't have enough information. It may, in fact, if it were possible, be that we have too much information. That was not the case, Ajay, when we were coming up. In fact, I was talking to Ginny Rometty the other day, and it dawned on me, looking at the world of artificial intelligence, that it may be that without artificial intelligence, it will be impossible to lead effectively, to actually have that as a conduit, because the flow of information is so great. And I think that changes a lot of things for you as you go out into major roles in the business world. That shift from information to context, understanding what does that information mean relative to the geopolitical environment that we live in, relative to the culture, the values, to the ways that problems become opportunities. The second is a shift from judgment to perspective. I think we grew up in an age where, as I think back on it, if you did this, then you knew that was going to happen. Today, there is a huge change and a convergence that's happening in the world. Convergence between industries and sectors and in so many different ways. And so it's much harder to live in the world of black and white. And I think we have to understand the perspective of what that looks like. And I call it the color gray. There's a shift between fact sharing, which in many ways as a leader was one of the important jobs that we had. And today I think you have to engage in the art of storytelling. And by the way, less is more when telling the story. And so some of these skills and the ability to teach these skills and to understand and use them in business school, I think are real imperatives moving forward. It's not that the facts are unimportant, but they are not able to be used in as isolated a fashion as they once were, for all kinds of reasons that we could spend hours on and we'll probably hit on in the course of our conversation. I think we're also moving from a world of rules to a world of values. And values are very different because they're the underpinning for everything. The facts might change, the world might change, who we associate with might change. But our values are the constant. And I think as I look at the educational system and I deal with some of the issues, and you can think of numerous situations that have come up just recently, Uber being one. Values are what lead us to decisions about behavior. Judgment simply evaluates after the fact. And last but not least, I think you're living in, and we're all living in, a world of massive agility. That need to be able to understand when it's appropriate to waltz and when we need a foxtrot. I think we're in an age when it really requires leadership to have the self-awareness, to understand not only what we're trying to do, but how that intersects with the values and the interests and opportunities of others. All of these are big shifts, but they represent opportunities to actually create a world that has considerably more purpose than the vanilla category of capitalism that I think we grew up with in business school years ago. And I see that shift happening in the boardroom. I work to lead the CEO succession process, so it's not just about who is the CEO, it's also about who's coming up, not just as the next CEO, but the CEO behind that, and perhaps the CEO behind that. We have a supposition that there are 7 CEOs in most every company, if you think about it in a multi-generational way. That's the world that you're moving into, and it's a world that enables you to connect and think and create in many different ways. And we're going to talk a little bit about innovation, and we can hit on that as well. But what I would encourage you to never lose as you're teaching or learning, and that is that fueling all of this is the power of curiosity. And I'll leave on that note. Ajay?
Thank you, Shane.
I'm going to just add a couple of thoughts to what Jane just said. And the first one is that now that I'm older and wiser and I look back on my career, the single most important definition was enjoyment and fun. And I didn't think that way when I was younger. And some of you are teachers and deans, and some of you are students. But when you're younger and 22 and 25 and you're starting out in a career, enjoyment is kind of interesting, but what you really want to do is to succeed. When you look back and you're 58, as I'm going to be soon, you're looking back, enjoyment and fun is everything. And success came because I enjoyed myself along the way, as compared to the other way around. And I think that driver of what creates success is something that I've learned over the years. You have to have fun in what you do. And I think if you want to have fun in what you do, then the environment you're entering into, like Jane was pointing out, and the environment I am currently in, is one where I think that you have to be, first of all, completely grounded in your customer. If your customer is a company buying a CEO succession thinking process from Jane, it's one kind of customer. If the customer is a person buying fruits and vegetables, it's a different kind of customer. But if you're not grounded in the consumer and the customer, and it's very easy to say this, it's really hard. This morning in my office, I had a bunch of people give me a presentation on digital identities and security, and they started with a slide saying it's all customer driven. And I can tell you, not even 1/10 of what they told me was customer driven. It was driven inside out, from what we could deliver as compared to what the consumer really needed to get from what we were making. So it's very easy to say it, it's really hard to actually live it every day. But the customer, number one. Number two, a deep understanding of technology and innovation. You don't have to be a geek, but you have to comprehend what it takes to make a geek work. And you have to comprehend what it takes to allow people around you to be innovative and constructively critical of you and of your company and of your success or lack of it. And the humility to understand that comes with that innovation. And the third part is, if you're unwilling to connect well with governments and with opinion leaders, and you look at Frank's career, Frank has moved back and forth between service for society and citizenry to very capitalist private sector enterprise, to then giving money and philanthropy in ways that is an example for many of us in this room. That kind of person whom we take for granted because you see him, you don't see a lot of those people every day these days. And if you're not willing to comprehend the importance of government and the role government and opinion leaders play on policy, and therefore the ability for your industry to succeed or not succeed, then you will fail miserably. And so getting the consumer or customer right, getting your comprehension of innovation and technology, and really comprehending the role of government and how you can interact with it in a constructive way is kind of the three things that I've learned are really helpful, and they're more helpful today than they were when I started. And I'll give you the last thought, and that is that A lot of people have talked about doing well and doing good at the same time, and it's vanilla flavor of the month to discuss it. Do not judge them by what they say, judge them by what they do. Because talk is easy, but actually taking your company and your personal energy and effort and actually trying to make a difference to the world around you at the time when it really matters is going to be what will determine your happiness and enjoyment in your job, and therefore your success, which is where I started from. And so my advice to anybody who is willing to listen, you don't have to agree, just listen, is you got to enjoy yourself, because that'll get you success. You'll do it well if you focus on the customer. You'll have a great time enjoying yourself, doing new things with innovation. Governments are important, but most importantly, don't forget you're a citizen of the community in which you live and work, and making people around you care about you and you care about them, and having the decency to come to work every morning thinking you would make a difference to them, that's what will make you really happy and therefore really successful.
Thank you. You both set the stage for a lively discussion. I'll pause from time to time to ask anybody from the audience if they have a question for either of these panelists. Okay. My opening thoughts, I talked a little bit about the fast-changing world that both of you are now in the middle of. And your clients are the successful ones who are planning for a completely different future. And your company, and I've heard you talk about it for years now, has planned for evolutionary change. Looking at it from a business school, what can business schools do to help prepare young people for that part of the business world going forward? And what do you look for in young people to spot it?
Want to give it a crack? Okay, so Frank, first of all, I think that the level of pace of change around each of us has accelerated enormously with all the things that technology has done to enable that acceleration. So, I think in our industry, which is payments and data, you can rest assured that the next 5 years will see more change than the previous 15. And that really means that anybody who believes that standing still is a good idea, that's a loser. And therefore, if you see Lord of the Rings and you think that you can make a castle and those hordes will come at you and you can shoot arrows at them and throw stones and pour hot water and boiling oil and somehow you'll keep them off, you will lose. Because there's more of them than you, and they will eventually breach your defenses and they will climb over your wall and into your castle. So you got to move your castle around. Your moat's not enough. The walls are not enough. You got to move the castle around so the buggers can't get you. That is a critical part of taking your business forward for the next 20 years. The agility to move your company around to suit where it needs to be so it's never standing still, waiting to be shot at or waiting for the hordes to climb over the wall and the moat. I think that's the biggest single thing you can do. So to do that, you've got to have people who are willing to do that, and you as a manager have got to be willing to let them do it, which really means they're going to make a lot of mistakes while doing that. And so I used to be in marketing, as you know, in the early part of my career, and I knew that if I was spending $10, I was wasting 5. The problem is I didn't know which 5. So you got to spend the 10 to find the 5 that made sense, so you can figure out the other 5 didn't make sense. And it's the same with innovation and new things. You're going to try out 10 things, and 9 are going to be abject failures. The problem is you don't know which is the 1 out of the 10. So the willingness to take risk and stomach failure and absorb the failure without shooting the guy who caused the failure is a very different management style from the management style of 20 years ago. It's a style that encourages this innovation, encourages failing, encourages the idea of figuring out what to invest on and what to kill early. And I think that requires both an effort from the person coming in, but an even bigger effort from the person leading. Because it's really hard for the leader to get up, to go away from that behavior pattern that they grew up in. And so I think the onus is a little bit more on the company and the leader than it is actually on the person coming in.
Jane?
Well, I'll pick up on sort of what does that have in the way of implication to higher education. And I think, you know, if you think in terms of a person as having kind of four aspects, one being sort of what people do, the experiences that we have, the competencies that we demonstrate, and then who the person is inside. What are those characteristics and traits, and how do they use them successfully in the world, and what drives them? I think education has been very geared in the past in business school to understanding a basis of information. I think moving forward, we really have to help students understand the world and understand who they are in the world. And that creation of connectivity is becoming really vital for leaders moving forward. I hear this all the time in terms of having people who have an aptitude to see around corners. And that is not something that is necessarily innate. A lot of the things that we're looking to for the future are counterintuitive to what we've known in the past. You know, how do we help, from an educational perspective, create comfort being uncomfortable? How do we teach people to understand how to convey a concept quickly, effectively? How do we help prioritization to occur? And not through a fear of failure, but through the curiosity that's going to lead people to the right answers. And how do we help people to understand that the biggest outcomes happen through empowering others, not through our own prowess? I think those are big shifts, and educationally, we really have to come to terms with those.
Any questions from the audience on what you've heard so far? Okay.
Frank, you've got a gentleman there with a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yell out.
So I have a question about, thank you so much for your comments so far, but I have a question about speed and innovation. I'm actually an artist, not a business person per se. And to create, you need time.
Yeah.
You need space for experimentation, failure, all the things you mentioned. I'm concerned about AI. Of course, my industry has already been touched by it because when I started as an artist, it was paint and brushes, and now it's all computer. But talk about that space, because I like what you're saying, that you have to create the space for someone to innovate and fail, versus the preconception that innovation has to be immediate.
So it's actually a really important point. When I talk about our industry and our company to our people, the first thing I mention to them is that procrastination is not your friend because of the pace of change around you, and you'll never have perfect information. And you know, Jane talked about information and data when she was giving her opening comments and talking about how AI could help you navigate that. My belief is that that actually too much data leads to decision paralysis and does not enable you to take thoughtful risks, which is actually what you're paid to do. And therefore, the ability to look at data and information and quickly figure out what makes sense and what doesn't is a part of what a manager has to do, while respecting the space that their employees or their colleagues need to be able to generate new ideas. So that's the balance between urgency on the one hand, because procrastination is not your friend, and on the other hand, having the balance to comprehend that you're not going to get the right answer the first time out of the door, and that there will be steps in between, and there'll be failures, and there'll be the need to do it the right way. There is no science to this. You're an artist. There's no science form to this. There's only an art form. And the art form comes from your own experiences, your own willingness to give people the space. You know, we as a company, we've gone from, you know, in financial terms, if you measure us, I joined Mastercard eight years ago when Frank and I were together on a board. And it was a $20 billion market cap. Yesterday we closed at $152 billion. So in 8 years, we've multiplied 7.5 times. Our number of employees have multiplied 2.5, 3 times. Our ability as a brand to be seen as an innovative brand by the people in the industry, not by consumers. We're not actually a consumer company, we're a B2B to C company. But the ability by our clients to see us in innovation terms has gone up by leaps and bounds, so much so that they now come to us, merchants, banks, and other companies, come to us to seek to do innovation jointly through R&D labs and methodologies. All that's because I think we're beginning to demonstrate the space for time and failure, but also the deep pockets when you find an interesting thing to chase it down. That's not easy. Honestly, if I told you I knew exactly how I would get this done 8 years ago, I'd be lying through my teeth, and I learned long ago not to lie. So the trick here is to recognize that we probably have wasted a fair amount of money along the way. We've probably made a few mistakes along the way. I've probably lost a few good people along the way, but I feel relatively good about where we are at this point in our journey. And I feel very strongly that the DNA of the company comprehends now the balance between urgency and the depth that it takes to generate the right answer.
Yeah, I would just add, I wouldn't confuse urgency with hurrying.
Yeah, that's correct.
I think that urgency is about the power of decision making. And one of the things that I would comment on, Ajay, we've known each other for a lot of years now. I seldom have seen you in a hurry.
Other than when I'm going for a drink in the evening. When Frank's buying, then I'm always in a hurry.
So I think a good friend of mine wrote a book I'll recommend called The Pause Principle. And one of the things that enables people to move with speed and efficacy is actually creating space. And having done research on innovation, I will share that leaders who are effective at innovation, they make that an area of focus, creating that space. Steve Jobs said something really interesting that a friend of mine shared, and that is he used the analogy of walking down a street to determine your direction, or going up above and looking down and determining which path you would take from a higher level. So I've got a kind of a coinage for myself, which is if the problem is a difficult one, you need to elevate. Because the higher up you go generally, the more you can see patterns and connections that help to ferret out what that means. And when you're looking to move with urgency, sometimes it takes more time up front, but you mobilize an organization in a way that creates the speed and the value that Ajay was talking about.
Thank you. Just change the frequency here a little bit. Whether you like it or not, government and politics has a bigger and bigger impact on business.
Absolutely.
And you don't have to agree with the government when they do what they do, but you've got to do what they say, more or less. How do you train young people to be aware of that kind of environment and deal with it as a business leader?
So Frank, as you heard me in the opening, I could not agree with you more. And I think that it's even more exacerbated if you think about a global company operating in 200 countries.
That's what I was going to say.
Because it's one thing to think about American regulatory standards, and what tends to happen is a lot of American companies, as you know from our past, walk into countries overseas and will come with the approach of, if this works in America, it'll work here. That is really a bad idea, because it's not going to be either accepted, and therefore the probability of success reduces. And secondly, even if it was a really good idea, that's the worst way to sell it. So what I've learned over time is that you've got to imbibe in your business leaders, not just your policy department or your legal department, but your business leaders at the front in each country have got to feel that their job is as much to manage the franchise and its relationship with regulators and opinion leaders as it is to deliver the numbers that the country has put into its budget and plan. Because budgets and plan, you guys will all go and do this in the future. Budgets and plan are a bunch of bullshit. Because what is a budget? A budget is something you make in August of the prior year to be approved by the board in November of the prior year to be delivered to the next 13 months of the coming year. If you ever believe that what you thought in August of the prior year will apply in August of the next year as true and relevant, whether you're in a company or a university or a college, then you are fooling yourself. And therefore, I don't care about budgets beyond a point. I care about budgets as a way to direct strategy and resources, not as an end in itself. And that means really that to run the company on a flexible basis, which is what I'm saying, you need to be able to have an environment where people comprehend that flexibility. Governments don't comprehend flexibility the way companies do, and therefore asking a country manager to constantly make trade-offs of flexibility without giving them the ownership of government relationships locally is a fool's task. That was the first thing we did. That changed everything. The second thing is that it's really important to put yourself in the eyes of the opinion leader or government you're talking to. Understand what's important to them. Because after all, as a company from the US working in Indonesia, I'm there at the pleasure of the Indonesian government. They could decide to throw me out tomorrow morning, and I'll be done. And so I can fight and complain and moan and whine as much as I want, but they're in the driver's seat and I'm in the passenger seat on that topic of being there. So what I got to do is help them feel they're in the driver's seat, but actually take over the car and drive it. And the only way you can do that is by constructively engaging with them after understanding what speed they're willing to drive at, what direction they want to go in, and how much tolerance for risk they have. And then you can make them feel like they're driving when actually you're driving. That's the whole task of comprehending what that government needs. When a government in Taiwan says, I'm worried about my continuity of business, and that's why I want you to put data centers on soil, and we fight it saying, but that's destroying my business model, they don't really care about your business model. They're worrying about their citizenry in some way. So what they're really worrying about is when the undersea cable between Taiwan and the United States snaps in an earthquake, will people using your payment card going to buy bread and eggs and pay for water, will they be able to pay, or will there be a breakdown in their country because the cable broke? That's what they care about. You can keep talking about your business model, they care about their circumstances. Therefore, the trick is to make them find a way to meet their circumstances while you protect your business model. That is the core and the essence of comprehending the role government plays from their perspective and how business and government can come together in a completely symbiotic system without even getting into doing well and doing good, which is another topic. But just this itself, you got to understand it from their eyes as compared to your eyes.
I would really echo what you've said, and I think there's a mental orientation towards co-creation that is essential today, and it wasn't always the case, but there has to be an opportunity to together come to something that's an outcome that neither would create in isolation. And when you do that, it helps to mitigate some of the risk as well. Because we're living in a world where there's lots of surprising outcomes relative to governmental direction and focus. And in a global economy, I think we're going to see some more very significant shifts before the things settle out, if they do. And so really being able to speak the language, as Ajay said, but also, there's a level of engagement. I was just spending time with some board members for an organization whose business is really hamstrung or accelerated by government this last week. And it has to do with a lot of the policies in government on healthcare, which if you can predict it, then please see me afterwards. But one of the things that is an imperative is, how much time does a CEO then spend, and others on the leadership team, in Washington? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you don't, it will be the kiss of death. It's really, a right of entry. So I think you have to engage, you have to understand, And you have to learn how to co-create even if you don't agree with the direction that's being taken.
You know, Frank, I did my MBA in India. I haven't had the good fortune of studying in a school in the US, and my kids have, and I see the value of the way they're taught and how their minds are opened. I'd say on the business school side, the one thing I learned when I was in business school was take a complex problem and try and break it down into bite-sized chunks. And spend the time, and not be in a hurry, spend the time to comprehend the problem for its real simplicity,
Get to the
which
essence.
is the hardest thing to solve for,
Yeah.
and the hardest thing to get to. And then explaining to people the simplicity of what looks like a very complex problem is also one of the hardest things to do. I learned that at business school. What I didn't learn was the importance of comprehending government and regulatory and opinion leaders in the role of how business can advance or not advance, and the symbiotic relationship that government and business can have together. So if I had one thing, and I don't know enough of whether you teach that here or not, but I would say, if I had one thing to say, I would say don't change the ability to make students comprehend the importance of simplicity, but do change the ability for them to comprehend the importance of the complexity that government can bring, and how to deal with it, and how to make it a friend and not an enemy. Just really, really important.
Thank you. Question from the audience.
Gentlemen here.
Yep.
So, I just want to get a few comments on how some of the changes that you mentioned are happening currently in the Asian global markets. China, a couple of days ago, just announced that they want to ban control import, so they're making a move to sustainable transport. So, how would that affect your lines of business? How do you think that would affect?
So again, if I was in the car manufacturing or battery manufacturing or gas stations or any of those businesses, I think there would be a seismic move in my future. India, where I was from originally, announced that by 2020 they want to get all new cars that are being manufactured, a certain proportion of them to be from electricity and natural gas. And so, you know, these are huge momentous moves that change where you put your R&D, where you put your distribution, how you build new cars, how your factories are retooled. If you were putting a new capital plan in to retool a factory, you'd wait, because the whole technology is going to go through a change. That's pretty much the same that happens to our kind of industry. And so the ability, I'll give you an example for China itself. In China, I'm not allowed to operate domestically in terms of domestic payments. I can only operate cross-border. You going to China or a Chinese coming here, I can play. But the moment it's a Chinese in China, it's monopolized by a local payment scheme that's owned by the Central Bank of China, which is owned by the government of China, which is also my regulator. So, you know, my regulator is also my biggest competitor, and go figure that one out. That only happens in China. And the fact is that that's the way it works. And I've spent 8 years communicating to them why that's a bad idea for the future of the Chinese economy and its growth. And I can give you 30 outstanding arguments for that. But at the same time, I do it with the patience of making them understand it from their eyes, as compared to telling them, you need to know that I'll give you an example from Sweden and America of how it works. It doesn't work. They're not interested. They can see that too. That patience is leading to a new dialogue, which today, in a little while, hopefully, will lead to a new circumstance for us to work in that marketplace. And that'll change how I invest. So whether it's policy on cars and sustainable development, or policy on payments, or today's announcement that China's central bank is shutting down Bitcoin exchanges, that impacts somebody else's life. And the moment you understand that, therefore, government policy, and before government policy, opinion leaders, and how public discourse happens in a country, and what pressure points that creates for a person in government service. If you asked Frank how he used to face pressure in his days in government service, he could give you a whole a diatribe about the goods and the bads of it, and how he navigated it. That's what I mean. Having that sensitivity in you when you start your career, so you're learning every day with the curiosity that she talked about to care about this topic, well, I tell you, it'll make you a very successful businessman for all the right reasons. I'm not giving you any nonsensical reasons about managing governments or lobbying against them. That's nonsense. You live and work in that country at their pleasure. So you better find a way for your technology and your product to be useful to them and their citizenry. That's what makes for successful global long-term franchises.
Jay?
I think we had some other questions.
Ajay, a few minutes ago, you made a mention on how your educational experience shaped your career. Switch focus and tell us about your favorite teachers. What do you remember about them, and what was so valuable in your life?
You want to go first? You want to go first?
I'll go first. You know, I couldn't tell you much about what they taught me in terms of the coursework. But my favorite teachers were teachers who really made me think, who were able to wrestle with real issues and create a different context around how I dealt with them. So that would be my quick answer.
In high school in India, my favorite teacher was a Irish missionary. They were teachers and ran schools, and he was the principal of the school. And when you played cricket at lunchtime, if you hit a six, when you came back to your classroom, in your desk was a brand new cricket ball because you'd hit that into the hills. So you needed a new one, and a Cadbury's 5-star bar, which when you're a young boy in India who couldn't afford to buy that stuff, that was a pretty good gift. And it was his way of saying, I watched you, and I'm celebrating your success with you. Mm-hmm. So I learned from him, and I've said this to him, I met him a few times before he passed away about 7-8 years ago, and I told him one of the biggest things I learned from you was the value of communicating that I watch and I celebrate with you. And that's the one. The second one is not really in school or college, but is my first boss at Nestle. He was an Irishman, guy called, so he's Finbar Jeremiah Ryan, F.J. Ryan, otherwise called Barry. Barry Ryan was a guy who could drink more booze than 6 other people put together. So he was true to his Irish heritage. And he taught me never to take no for an answer. And I mean that in a constructive way. I don't mean it in a negative way, because not taking no for an answer can be very negative. But he sort of said, people will tell you why they can't do something. But to figure out the person in the company who tells you, yes, if you do it this way, that's the cool guy. That's the guy you got to connect with. And I use those lines in my company all the time about there are too many people empowered to say no. There are too few who are empowered and feel the pressure to say yes, if. And I think that's kind of a thing that stayed with me through that. And the third one is somebody whom both Frank and I have had the pleasure and the pain of working with, and that's Sandy Weil. And I would tell you, he gets criticized for many things, but one thing he was a prince at. He knew how to connect with you at your level when it mattered to you. So just as my teacher gave me the cricket ball and the 5-star bar, when the merger of Travelers and City happened, and I came from the city side, and I came for the first time to the US for a meeting, and there was a big meeting with about 150 people in what we used to call the planning center in a place called Armonk Uptown, upstate. And there was a kind of a mezzanine, and below that a ground floor, and there were 150 people standing there. Now I do stand out a little bit because of the turban and beard, so I think I'm giving him too much credit. He probably could figure out it was the same guy. If it was a different Sikh, you wouldn't have known, because you can't figure out the difference unless you know, right? There's too much hair and not enough facial features. But from a distance, I think it kind of looked like the guy he'd met. He'd met me once. He came through the entire group of 150 people, straight to me and said, give me a hug, and said, I need more people like you at my decision table. And it bought my loyalty for life, because he cared about a guy who was, those days, I don't know, 5, 6 levels junior to him, back in 98, 99. And that I've learned these lessons from teachers of different types for different reasons. But the one that this all brings you together to the ability to celebrate success and recognize success and have the humility to connect with people for who they are and what they do and how they do it as compared to what you want them to do for you.
Let me just drill a little deeper on a question of globalization and geopolitical change, which impacts your business on a regular basis. How do schools like ours get student leaders ready for that? How do we, I had lunch today with Professor Ray, who is my partner in teaching a course here, talked about students spending time outside of the country during their coursework. How about the requirement for a language? What do we need to do to better prepare them for the international world?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you made the comment about leaving the country. It is such a different thing to learn about a culture than it is to live in a culture. And really understanding and having navigated in 2 or 3 cultures, I think makes a huge difference in your ability to fully appreciate decision-making that factors that global thought process into the equation. And further along, I mean, if you have to navigate it with the family, I think that makes even a bigger difference. In terms of languages, I think it's an obvious. The question is, which ones? We used to think in terms of Spanish, which is a very good choice. But I think, learning Mandarin and, some of the other very large economies is going to be critical. And of course, you think differently when you can think innately in a language than when you're in an interpretive mode. So I think that stressing that, I've been interested to hear from my son that there's a lot of kids at Georgia Tech taking German. So that wasn't something that was as common when I was in business school. So I think there's a huge shift. I don't think it's just the traditional languages. And I think there's something to be learned just from the process of learning another language or two, right? It's not even just speaking in the language. Ajay?
So I'm going to be a little radically different on this one. I actually don't think business schools should task themselves too hard on teaching too many things about stuff that you cannot directly possibly find the right way to do it in. So let me give you an example. This particular example of globalization and multiple cultures, you can help. You can try and find professors who have lived overseas and come here to teach, CEOs and business executives who have global nature and experiences to come and speak at the school. You can create a layer of exposure for your community. So hopefully by osmosis, some of it will go in. But I'll tell you what really makes a difference is if you can teach students that when they come to work, instead of constantly questioning what opportunities are coming their way, to somehow evaluate them in some ill-formed, misinformed way of creating priorities, if they just took them and rolled with them, life will be just fine. Because companies are actually desperately planning to send their managers and their employees through multiple experiences. You know what the problem is? Most employees don't want them. They pretend to want them. The moment you tell them, hey, I got to transfer you to Singapore, the guy says, my father's not well, he's old, my mother can't go, my daughter's not here, my nephew's not well, I can't move this year, after 2 years, I need 2 schools, 3 schools, 1 car, 4 houses. It's like a nightmare. Whereas, if you said, I'm going to seize this because somebody in the company understands that if I get exposure to multiple geographies and multiple cultures, I'll become a better manager and a better employee, and I'm going to take this chance and run with it, which is what we've all done who've been successful. And looking back, I think it'll be really interesting. I lived in 9 different cities across 3 continents before my younger daughter finished high school. And you talk to the average American employee in a company, and they will give you 8 reasons, mostly to do with schooling for their children. But in fact, the real thing is, the kids adjust really well. It's the parents who find it tougher to adjust. But they complain using the kid in the front, because the kid is the one you can't fight about. And I really think, attitudinally, Frank, that would be a great experience to go through. Teach your students, some of whom are here today, that, you know what, guys, there's a great future out there. Seize it and run with it. Take a few chances. Live a little on the edge. And it'll be a lot of fun. It really is for a global company. As compared to asking you to somehow prepare a kid who's with you for 2 years to be a global citizen. Maybe I'm asking you for too much. All I can ask you to do is to give them an orientation and a way of thinking. And if you do that well, you'll be doing me a big favor as a CEO when I employ your students.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but it certainly proves the point of what Ajay is saying. We're doing a project with the Rockefeller Foundation called 100 by 25 Initiative, which is looking at getting 100 of the Fortune 500 CEOs to be women by 2025. And in the course of that, we interviewed 58 Fortune 1000 women who are currently or recently were CEOs. And one of the things that was a constant across that group was a huge capacity and interest and drive for challenge. Loved taking on the impossible tasks, loved understanding what might make the difference, and really went for it. And I think it was a huge, I thought, inspirational learning to think about that, because that's really what Ajay is saying. So even though there were lots of headwinds that were potentially, described, they didn't see them as headwinds. They saw them as opportunities. They saw them as interesting challenges. They saw them as opportunities. And interestingly, and I think there's a lesson in this, much broader than women, they took on many horizontal kinds of challenges.
Correct.
So they moved across borders, if you will, inside functional spheres, operating spheres, geographies, et cetera. And if I were to give you a challenge relative to what Ajay was saying, I would just really encourage you, seize the opportunities that you have. Don't look in terms of what you're entitled to. Look in terms of what is possible. What could I learn? Learning, curiosity, drive. These are things that will serve well in the long term. And I had gotten a quote that I hung in my son's bathroom where he dried his hands every day. And it was from Albert Schweitzer, and it talks about that those who have joy in this life are those who have learned to serve. And I think, one of the things that you'll find is you will be as successful as those you help succeed around you. And it's just a truism. I've seen it 1,000-fold in working with leaders for 3 decades.
We're going to have time for one more question. Is there anybody from the audience? Herman.
So the qualities that you're talking about really are essential qualities for success. Who is able to teach those qualities? Do we have the faculty? What skill set? Who really is able to provide the kind of education that would give the graduates the attitudes that you're looking for, that willingness to take a chance, that willingness to be somewhat on the edge? Who can do that? And who can do it at the scale that we need to do it to be successful, really, for everyone that we're trying to give a good education to?
Well, I think it needs to be modeled, first of all. And I think it's teachers that are grounded themselves. So it's not just what the person brings in the way of learning, but who they are in doing it. I didn't share the name of the teacher that I was commenting on. His name was Gary Gleason, and he taught geometry. I hate geometry. But what was really unique about Gary was that he really wrestled with issues, and he got in there and got in the mud with me on thinking about life geometrically. So he took it out of a context that I did not appreciate. Still don't.
You like geometry now?
No. But I use geometric reasoning a lot, and that I learned from Gary. And so I think it's about, I think it's about helping to reason. I think it's about looking at real experiences and bringing those into the classroom. I think it's about creating anticipation. I had lunch with a great innovator today, Beth Comstock, and we were talking about this, and we were commenting that it's a bit like in today's world, there's so much convergence and so much change that you put in, assuming that vending machines are even relevant, you put in the coins for Oreo cookies and you get barbecue chips, right? I mean, I think part of what our business schools are dealing with is, what is the quid pro quo? I don't think anybody knows. I think what we have to be able to help leaders learn, and it's not just, it's not just early in our careers, it's a continual journey, is that the success is the journey, number one, that you never finish, you're not looking to achieve something that's in final, that it is about a constant growth, a constant curiosity, a constant wanting to participate, engage, and inspire and contribute. How can we all be net givers? Think about what that would do in the world. And business has such a huge opportunity, and I think the whole business arena is shifting today. What I see is we've done quite a bit of research on purpose-driven leadership, and the results are enormous, enormous. If you look at equivalencies, and that's a shift where we're starting to think not only about business as an isolated endeavor, but what is the connectivity between business and government and society? That's what we have to wrestle with, because that's life, right? I just came from Atlanta, and we were next door neighbors to the worst victims of Irma, and frankly, yesterday morning, if you'd asked me, I would have put good odds that I wasn't going to be able to get out. We're looking at issues with North Korea that are issues of survival, right? We're looking at core issues that have an opportunity to bring us together, to bring thinkers and to bring doers to a point of connectivity that changes the world, literally. I think that's a huge opportunity, and I think we shouldn't waste it. And I don't think the engagement level in general that I see, not just in business school, but just in higher education in general, would indicate that we're addressing that need.
I think the only thing I'd add is that, when I think about what you pick up at business school, there are 4 or 5 factors that develop you in your couple of years there. There's your faculty, there's your peer group of other students, there's speakers who come, industry leaders and others who come and speak there. There's where you go and do your summer internship. And then there's those trips that schools typically organize that give you a chance to work for 10 days or 20 days with a business in Brazil or South Africa or something of that type. I think that's a pretty rich combination of stimuli for a curious student to pick up a fair amount of input. The question is, are you tweaking their curiosity enough, not just through the stimuli, but through what then happens when they come back to class? And I think if you do that well, which I have no experience to be able to tell you whether you're doing it well or not, but my sense is if you do that well, that's a fair amount of stimuli for a young person to get who's already worked for some years and is then coming back to do a master's in business from this combination of 4 or 5 external methodologies. I actually think that business schools in the US have figured out the stimuli methods quite well. It's a question of what you do with the stimuli that I'm not sure each school is doing to the same quality.
So we have heard a lot about the challenge, the opportunity, the future, the change. You have to manage this stuff through sometimes adversity, which is part of reality. Think of yourself as the CEO of a commercial bank in 2009. You might have been the best Boy Scout in the entire world, but when you tell people, when they say, what do? You say, I run a bank. You better run and hide. And you had to manage an institution through that period of our history where that chemistry was in the air. And that's part of leadership, which isn't always fun and games. Jane, Ajay, you both did a terrific job. You're really wonderful, so I appreciate you coming, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Reading with that.
Who work for 10 days or 20 days with a business in Brazil or South Africa or something of that type. I think that's a pretty rich combination of stimuli for a curious student to pick up a fair amount of input. The question is, are you tweaking their curiosity enough, not just through the stimuli, but through what then happens when they come back to class? And I think if you do that well, which I have no experience to be able to tell you whether you're doing it well or not, but my sense is if you do that well, that's a fair amount of stimuli for a young person to get who's already worked for some years and is then coming back to do a master's in business from this combination of 4 or 5 external methodologies. I actually think that business schools in the US have figured out the stimuli methods quite well. It's a question of what you do with the stimuli that I'm not sure each school is doing to the same quality.
So we have heard a lot about the challenge, the opportunity, the future, the change. You have to manage this stuff through sometimes adversity, which is part of reality. Think of yourself as the CEO of a commercial bank in 2009. You might have been the best Boy Scout in the entire world, but when you tell people, when they say, what do? You say, I run a bank. You better run and hide. And you had to manage an institution through that period of our history where that chemistry was in the air. And that's part of leadership, which isn't always fun and games. Jane, Ajay, you both did a terrific job. You're really wonderful, so I appreciate you coming, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Reading with that.